A newspaper reporter went to interview a successful entrepreneur who was worth $20 million. He finally got a sit-down interview with him and asked him, "How'd you do it? How'd you make all that money? $20 million. The man replied, "Well, I'm glad you asked. Actually, it's an amazing story. You see, when my wife and I got married, we started out with virtually nothing. In fact, we only had 5 cents between us, a nickel. I took that nickel and went down to the grocery store and I bought an apple and I shined it up and sold it for 10 cents. Well, what'd you do then?" the reporter, asked. The man said, "Well, I went and I bought 2 more apples, shined them up, and I sold them for 20 cents. And the reporter, is excited. He was thinking, this is going to be a great story when he wrote it up. Then he asked, excitedly, well, then what? Then what happened? And the man said, "Well, then one of my relatives died and left me $20 million. Over the years, it's kind of interesting when you think about human nature. He found it more interesting to think about that nickel and a couple of apples than the gift he'd been given. And over the years, he had convinced himself that he'd done something, forgetting that he had received everything." It reminded me of that when I explored in my study this next passage in Luke chapter 9, where I want to return your attention. The disciples have returned from their impact trip. They have been preaching, they have been performing miracles, and Jesus had delegated to them apostolic power, which would validate their ministry and would authenticate them as messengers of the King. They had experienced several weeks of amazing activity, incredible miracles just kind of flowed from their hands. It was a heady time, as we observed in our last study together. It eventually goes straight to their heads. In the near future, they're going to return from another trip abroad, and they're going to be so excited to tell Jesus about how even the demons were under their control, and the Lord will effectively say to them, "If you want a reason to be joyful, don't be joyful the demons listen to you. Be joyful that you're going to heaven." You see, pride is knocking on the door whenever we are more excited about what God does through us than what God has done for us. I'm convinced here in chapter 9 that had a reporter shown up and interviewed the disciples when they returned home, where Jesus had given them miraculous ability, I think the disciples would have probably told that reporter all about 2 apples they shined up and not what they had been receiving from the Lord. One author put the problem of our human nature in a humorous manner. He wrote this question. He said, "When Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the back of that donkey, and everybody was waving palm branches and singing praises, do you think that donkey had any idea that any of that was for him?" Well, after kindly and graciously pulling the disciples away to debrief them, instruct them, encourage them, teach them, prepare them, he's about to teach them, and that's the context we often miss, a tremendous lesson in humility in serving the Lord. So with that, let's repeat verse 10 as we read it and then move forward. On their return, the apostles told them all, note this, they had done. And he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. And when the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions. For we are here in a desolate place. Don't miss this here. The disciples are telling Jesus now how to do ministry. They're now in charge. They're now instructing the Lord. After all, they're veterans. They've been on a trip. So they evidently know when it's time to stop preaching. Lord, why don't you wrap up that last point? It's time to send all the people away to find provision, a place to stay for the night. You see, they know better than Jesus. They're telling Jesus what to do. Lord, here's how you do ministry. It's time to send them away, stop preaching. Let's prepare for the night. See, what they don't know is that Jesus is about to miraculously feed this crowd. In fact, Jesus is about to demonstrate the only miracle that will be recorded in all the Gospels besides the resurrection. It is this miracle feeding. It's probably recorded by all of them because they never got over it and what they learned. Now, if you combine the clues of all four Gospels, this event will be taking place around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on some afternoon in mid-April. John's Gospel account tells us that it begins by Jesus asking Philip this question: where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He said this to test them. Now, what's he testing? Their level of faith in his miraculous ability. Well, then they failed the test because it never crossed their mind that Jesus could perform a miracle on this scale. Was he testing their management and financial skill? Well, evidently Philip thought so. Because Jesus specifically asked Philip where they could buy bread. Why ask Philip? Why pull him out of the 12? Well, because this was his hometown. He knew where the bakery was. He knew the price of bread in this region. I love this. Philip thinks the Lord is seriously asking him how much money it would take. So he evidently, got out his pencil and his notepad and he starts figuring out the cost of this meal. Let's see, 5,000 men plus women and children. Multiply that by the cost of bread divided by 10 little pieces if they get a little bit to. I got it, Lord. Verse 7, look. 200 denarii worth of bread. Wow, but that wouldn't be enough to feed them, even if they only got a little. So he's got it all figured out. In other words, even if we had basically a year's salary on average, and even if everybody took little bitty bites, it wouldn't work. He's counting every penny. He just can't come up with enough change. Reminded me of those days when I'd look for change under the car seat or in the cushions in the couch. Been there? I remember those days in seminary when Marcia and I would see how much change we had between the two of us. I'd get just enough, go down the steps in the apartment to the little laundry room there and the vending machine, and I'd have just enough to buy one Dr. Pepper, and we'd split it. 3 sips for me, 1 for her. Maybe you're there right now. You're counting all the pennies. You're wondering what the Lord is going to do to provide. That's exactly where Jesus is taking them. He wants Philip to do the math. Go ahead, Philip. I think he's smiling to himself. Figure it out. How much is it going to take? See, the answer is more than we've got. That's the answer. And Philip says it's going to take 200 denarii to feed this crowd. And Luke says that evidently Jesus responds here in verse 13, but he said to them, you give them something to eat. Don't disperse the crowd. Don't send them away. You men, you feed them. That's always struck me. You feed them. Here's the context. You guys have the miracle stories. You guys have power over demons. You guys have just gotten back from successful ministry. You've become enamored with the things that come from your hands, so you go ahead and you feed them. That was a shocking command. He can't be serious. Well, John's gospel tells us that they'd found a boy's lunch. 5 loaves, 2 fishes. Which I love because evidently they've been scouting around while Philip's been doing the math. And this is all they'd come up with. So when Jesus tells them to feed the crowd, they're really speechless. All they can do is just sort of stammer out here in verse 13. We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish unless we are to go and buy food for all these people. See, suddenly, they are aware of their inability. They're suddenly confronted with the fact that all they've really done is shine a couple apples. That's it. Everything else they had done was through the power they had inherited from Jesus, and now they get it. They're so overwhelmed with this command and with this crowd that they completely, up to this point, have overlooked the Creator. See, Jesus is going to teach them some lessons in humility, which is going to become the foundation for Spirit-empowered, God-honoring ministry. He's going to teach them that they have nothing to offer people apart from Him. He's going to teach them that their hands are useless unless His hands are involved. He's going to teach them they have no power apart from His provision. He's going to teach them their inadequacy is the perfect opportunity to trust His sufficiency. Now, John's gospel gives us the detail that Andrew was the disciple who actually found the boy's lunch. But, and we're not going to, for the sake of time, go over there, but I love the fact that Andrew gives it to the Lord, and then he apologizes and says to Jesus, but what is this among so many? In other words, silly me for even handing you this lunch. What am I thinking? The other disciples are probably saying, what are you thinking, Andrew? Give the kid his lunch back. But it's too late. It's now in the master's hands. And here's another lesson to learn. Jesus can use whatever you give him. Don't overlook the obvious. This is about to become the most famous brown bag lunch in church history. And the amazing thing is that it isn't just that Jesus will do so much with so little. What strikes me is that he chooses to use what little we give him. And he does so much. I'm so glad for that, aren't you? Today, whatever you put into his hand, don't ever say, well, I'm just one little person. I just have a little talent. I just have a little experience, if that. Just put it into his hands and let him multiply it however he wants, according to his will. Now I want to take a closer look at this lunch. It included barley bread. John's gospel clarifies that for us. That's the common bread of the poor. It was less desirable by far. It was coarse, its texture, than wheat bread. This was barley bread. Barley bread was most often fed to livestock. So this clues us in on the poverty level of this young boy. The word translated loaves here is a word that refers to pieces of bread that would have fit in the palm of your hand, not like the loaf you'd buy down at the store. It would have been small, round, flat, pancake-like pieces of barley bread that would have been stacked in his hand easily enough. We're also told here that the boy had 2 fish. The Greek word is opsaria. This is a little minnow, a little sardine. The people in this day added spices and relish to it. It gave flavor to their rather bland meal. So basically, this boy has 2 pickled fish to help his coarse, dry barley bread go down. And now with that, Jesus gives another shocking command to his disciples. Verse 14. Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. And they did so and had them all sit down. Now remember, Jesus has told, the disciples to feed the crowd. He hasn't taken that back. He said, you go feed them. They're just kind of standing around looking at each other. He says, well, we'll go tell them to sit down. The interesting thing here, lost to the English reader, is it isn't the verb for just, take a seat. This verb means to recline at a table. In other words, Jesus says, you go tell them to get ready for a meal. Now, this would have been customary, the low tables, to prop up on an elbow. You go tell them to prop up on an elbow, recline because a meal is coming. Can you imagine their panic as they're going around telling people to go ahead and sit down, food's coming? Where in the world is the food coming from? Don't know. I'm supposed to feed you. Come to the table. The gospel accounts tell us this crowd is around 5,000 men. You add the women and the children, and this miracle is improperly designated in the outline in your Bible, which is not inspired, the feeding of the 5,000. It ought to read the feeding of the 15,000, or perhaps more. Can you imagine their panic? How are they going to feed 15,000 people? Here's another reason why I believe Jesus had everybody recline before performing the miracle. See, they're all going to be able now to watch it happen. And at first, I think the crowd is probably just as mystified as the disciples are terrified. They've been called to dinner. But now that they're reclining, they can clearly see that the Lord doesn't have mountains of bread stacked around him. The Lord doesn't have this large boatload of fish that's just been delivered. It's just him and a little sack lunch. He wants them to get the point of what he's about to demonstrate. They're about to see a stunning miracle here. This is going to be an undeniable, visible, tangible, edible miracle. I like the way one author put it. Jesus didn't have any fish up his sleeve. No trickery here. And there's a deeper purpose behind the miracle for the crowd at large, because you see, the rabbis were teaching in Jesus' day that when the Messiah comes, he will reproduce the miracle of manna in the wilderness. The Messiah will deliver manna from heaven again. Jesus, he's about to answer the age-old question delivered in Psalm 78. Will God prepare a table in the wilderness? And Jesus says, yes, watch. It's about to happen. By the way, the bread, or this crowd that will eat this bread, they're going to be so blown away by this demonstration of divine messianic power that after he does this, John's gospel tells us the crowd is ready to crown him king. There's no doubt he's the one. I also find it interesting that after this happens, he actually preaches, telling the crowd that he is the bread of life. He's not only delivering manna from heaven, but he himself is everlasting manna from heaven. Now notice verse 16. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves, gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. The Gospels record that Jesus essentially stands there and breaks apart the bread and fish in his hands, and the disciples collect pieces and deliver them. Now, Luke makes it clear that it's all happening in his hand. He uses the tenses, the construction. He kept on, you could read, he kept on breaking them, giving them pieces of bread and fish to his disciples. Now, I don't know if the disciples used their outer tunics to hold all the bread and the fish, and they moved around the groups, and people just reached in and grabbed handfuls, and then when they ran out, the disciples, ran back to Jesus and got loaded up all over again. But I wonder if they're getting the point here that Jesus is the supply, and they merely provide the service. That's true to this day. Beloved, Jesus is the originator. Jesus is the creator. We're just the courier. If we ever get that turned around, we're going to talk about apples. We shined up. And not what we've inherited. Jesus keeps filling up their hands. He's literally creating bread and fish, by the way. He's bringing basket loads of bread and fish, pickled fish, into existence. The implication is even the spices and even the relish. He's bypassing all the time needed to marinate it and to bake it and all. He's just creating all of this in his hand. He is the creator. By him were all things created, Colossians 1. Let me give you an illustration of what my hands can create. Luke now tells us in verse 17, and they all ate and were satisfied. The word Luke uses here for satisfied, kortazo, means literally to be filled up. Literally, you could render it to fatten. This was the Greek term used for the fattening of animals with feed. The rancher, the farmer brought them into the barn or into the corral and let them gorge on food until they could eat no more. That's why you take your kids to Golden Corral. Perfectly named restaurant, by the way, where they eat until they can eat no more, at least for a few hours. Evidently, the Lord's okay with that periodically, because he doesn't just make enough. He makes enough to where they are all stuffed, and then there are leftovers. You see, skeptics, and I don't want to bore you with all their unbelief, but they've suggested that this would have been impossible for Jesus to do. So what really happened was that little boy so motivated everybody, they all took out their lunches and shared them with each other. That's sweet. Luke demolishes that theory here in verse 17. And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces. It all came from his hand. Now even the disciples have one basket each of leftovers. Why? Well, they get to eat too. If we were the Lord, we might have made him go hungry. But every time they eat, they're going to be reminded of this moment when they were entirely inadequate and he was entirely sufficient. I love the way Alexander Maclaren wrote on this text 100 years ago. They're going to remember that they always found his hands were full whenever they came back to him with their hands empty. See, that's serving him by serving others. He fills our hands with whatever it is, and we give it away. And we come back to him, and he fills our hands again. Did they learn this lesson of humility and service? Well, when the Apostle Peter comes to the end of his life, he writes a couple of inspired letters. Nowhere in those letters does he list any of the powerful things he did in ministry. Hey, I was the guy who healed a man who had been lame from birth. I was the man who spoke in a language I never studied. I was the man who preached the opening sermon in church history, and it was so powerful. 3,000 people came to faith. Not a word of that. Instead, old Peter writes, clothe yourselves with humility, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He spoke of the glory of Christ. As one letter ends, for to him belongs all power. He's the powerful one. All power, dominion, forever and ever. We don't stand around and talk about some apple we shined up and the profit we made. If you did, that's great initiative, wonderful. Just don't forget the inheritance you received from the one who made you, the one who gifted you, the one who filled your hands, the one who saved you, who daily forgives you. That's the one we want to talk about. The one who deserves all the credit and all the glory and all the praise. Our Creator, our supplier,